Hello and welcome to the Responsive Family Sleep Podcast. I'm your host, Kim Hawley, holistic sleep coach, lactation consultant, peaceful parenting educator, and mom. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by all the conflicting sleep info, frustrated with sleep information that just plain felt wrong, or searched desperately for a truly gentle and responsive sleep approach, then you are in the right place. In each episode, we'll be answering your most pressing baby and toddler sleep questions, busting those sleep myths, and helping you understand truly developmental, biologically normal baby and toddler sleep, plus encouraging you to trust your intuition along the way. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. This week, we are talking about wake windows. And depending on sort of what you've read about sleep, you might be like, ooh, wake windows are the best thing ever. Or you might be over there cringing, being like, wake windows are terrible and they're so stressful and I hate them. And aren't they not really real? Anyway, right, wake windows are a really popular piece of sleep, guidance, advice, part of sleep schedules in a lot of people's sleep work and sleep information, and they're also completely made up. They are not evidence-based, and they're not really a real thing. So why do we keep talking about them, right? And why am I, maybe more importantly, why am I doing a podcast episode on them? Well, I feel like wake windows are so, prominent to the point that they are dogmatic. People are so obsessive and precise about them. Even people who don't necessarily want to go the sleep training route don't realize how much a part of sort of the overall sleep training culture wake windows are. And so I see them stressing parents out all the time. And we'll talk about why that is more in a minute. And then I see people who find them kind of utterly useless, and that tends to be people who they didn't work for, or sort of more attachment baby-led sleep folks. And to be honest, I'm more of a mind of those folks, but I do actually use them in my work in a very specific way, not in a very precise and rigid way, if that makes any sense at all. So if you think of it as a continuum from wake windows are these strict, precise things, all the way to wake windows have no place in a sleep conversation, right? That's our sort of continuum. I'm in they can be helpful if viewed flexibly, not as rules, and that we recognize that if they are causing us stress, we can let them go because they're not evidence-based. So let's dive into this a little bit more. What actually are wake windows? Well, they're just this idea that we have a specific amount of time that a baby is going to be awake at a given age, between naps or, between nap and bedtime. And so I think very, very loosely, wake windows are trying to turn the idea of sleep pressure, which is a real thing, right? The need to fall asleep that builds up over the time that you're awake, right? They're taking this idea of sleep pressure and trying to control it and make it precise in a way that doesn't work, right? In a way that isn't how sleep pressure works, right? Because sleep pressure does vary by age, right? Of course, newborns don't stay awake as long as 6-month-olds, who don't stay awake as long, generally speaking, as toddlers. But it varies significantly from baby to baby, and it can vary from day to day based on our activity and stimulation, and it can vary throughout the day, right? I don't think most babies have really precise, evenly spread naps. We want to talk about naps being well spread, but usually there's some variation in how those naps tend to fall throughout the day, and that's normal. So it's like you're taking this thing that's very fluid, but does have some patterns, sleep pressure, and trying to control it in a way that is only going to work for a very small, narrow set of babies. But then we took that and we said all babies should be like this, right? All 3-month-old babies should have, I don't know, an hour and 22-minute wake windows, right? And that's ridiculous because not all babies build sleep pressure at the same rate. Not all babies need the same amount of sleep. And so those are kind of important factors. So how did we get these wake windows? It looks like, because right? Generally, we kind of take the total sleep amount a baby needs and then kind of think, okay, well, if they're getting so much at night and they're getting so much during the day, what does that mean for how long they should be awake to make that sleep all work? So it's like we're extracting that information from other sleep information. And that's kind of how I would do it too. The difference is that when we're looking at sort of mainstream ways of talking about sleep or wake windows, it's much more rigid and the ranges are much more narrow. And often there's a lot of fear-based messaging for what happens if your baby doesn't fit into this sort of generic schedule. And often, at least the apps that my clients share the sleep information with me from, they're often taking wake windows sort of extracted from the higher end of sleep ranges, meaning that, let's say it's 6 months, most babies are sleeping somewhere between 12 and 15 hours. And so they might be assuming your baby needs 15 hours, sleeps 11 hours overnight, gets 4 hours of naps, and then they are pulling wake windows from that, right? Those wake windows are going to be much shorter than a baby who actually only needs 13 hours of sleep at 6 months, right? And sleeps 10 hours overnight and 3 hours of naps. And so not only do we have these sort of generic, really rigid wake windows that are really commonly shared, but they're often not going for average sleep. They're often skewing those calculations based on a higher sleep totals in the range of what's expected. So all that's to say, right, is that wake windows can cause a lot of stress if you're looking at this sleep schedule that you got from whatever sleep tracking app and your baby is just not fitting into those sleep nap timings and those wake windows, right? And everyone's like, oh, wake windows are so important, right? But sometimes, on the other hand, not paying any attention to how long your baby's been awake, especially for babies who are really hard to read, right? The babies that seem to go from everything is great and I'm happy and I'm playing to like a switch is flipped and they're melting down because they're so tired, right? They are not receiving their body's cues of tiredness until they're beyond tired and they're super dysregulated, or they're not able to signal those to you, right? So we can have these babies that are really hard to read, or just parents that have a lot of other priorities, right? Or we're trying to communicate with other caregivers. And sometimes having no awareness of, how long is your baby comfy being awake, right? How can we make sure naps are spread well throughout the day so there aren't any huge awkward gaps that lead to a dysregulated baby, or we're trying to put a baby down, way too early when they're not tired and then getting frustrated, right? So that's where sometimes having a loose idea of, hey, often babies at this age are comfy awake for, 90 minutes to 2.5 hours, right? Which is a big range, but pay attention in there and look for cues. Let's play around with that concept, right? It's still a wake window. It still sometimes can create stress for some parents. I have introduced that concept to parents and then told them to drop it before because it was really not working for them. But for a lot of the parents that I work with, that's just enough guidance to help you think about, oh, this is how we should be spreading the naps. And yet enough fluidity that we're not attached to a specific number. And then I'm always sharing with parents, the real thing is watch the baby, right? And be willing to experiment. Let's see if we aim for something a little bit shorter or a little bit longer than what you've been doing. What does that do? So, wake windows, right? I think in general, if you're just looking at a sleep schedule or you're reading a blog or you're looking at an app or whatever, bottom line is they are not evidence-based, right? You should not allow them to rule your life. You should not force your baby into wake windows that aren't working for them. You should be ready for flexibility from day to day because that's part of being human, right? And, if it's helpful to you to have some general ideas of, hey, it's typical at this age, it's common at this age for babies to be awake kind of this amount of time, I find that can be a really helpful starting point, but then always come back to your baby. Knowing, right, that some babies are just going to be more sporadic and some babies are going to be more regular. And that is, of course, going to impact your experience. So I hope you found this helpful. I find wake windows to be a really interesting concept, right? And like I said at the beginning and throughout, I think they can create a lot of stress for a lot of parents. I think we way treat them as these precise things they aren't. I think it's always good to remember they are not evidence-based. But I think knowing some patterns and trends can sometimes be a really helpful tool for some parents to start to just make sense out of what they're seeing and how they're communicating across caregivers and just thinking about sleep spread, throughout the day. So I'd love to hear your experience with wake windows and whether this resonates with what you already knew or change what you thought or any sort of thoughts on them, because I find that this can be a big aha moment for parents when they're like, oh my God, wake windows are not like the law of the land. This is so amazing. So feel free to head over to Instagram, send me a DM, send me an email. I'd love to hear. Thank you for joining me today. I hope this episode left you feeling more informed, confident, and encouraged on your sleep journey. And just a reminder before you go that nothing in this episode is individualized to your specific sleep situation, nor is it to be taken as medical advice. Take what resonates, ignore what doesn't, and check with your healthcare provider about any medical concerns. Take a moment to subscribe to this podcast so that you'll never miss an episode. And take a moment to rate, review, or share an episode you love on social media. All of that helps parents just like you find me, this podcast, and this gentle and responsive sleep information. I'll see you next time.